Hi, I'm Brandon Schmidley, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Evangel University. You're watching a presentation in the Evangel Philosophy Guest Lecture Series. Today's lecture is by Dr. Jerry Walls from Houston Baptist University, and it's titled, What's Wrong with Calvinism? This lecture was made possible in part by a generous donation from the Society of Christian Philosophers. Thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the presentation.
Rumor has it on the way over here that there are Calvinists in this audience. Is this true? Now let me see hands up if the Calvinists among us. Are there any open-minded Calvinists among us? Okay. Well, good. Well, for those of you who may not know what Calvinism is, let me begin by saying what it is. Calvinism, of course, is a very powerful, significant theological tradition, particularly a theology of the nature of salvation. Now, it is named after him, John Calvin. Appropriate name for it, Calvinism. But he didn't invent it, and it wasn't St. Paul, by the way, who invented it, as Calvinists like to allege. But it really goes back, the fountainhead of it is St. Augustine. St. Augustine. And it's been a very powerful stream of theology in the Western Church, both in its Roman and its Protestant variations. So on the Protestant side, notable people like Luther, Calvin, Jonathan Edwards, probably the greatest theologian America's ever produced, Calvinists, great preachers like Spurgeon, Whitefield, and the like. On the Roman side, probably St. Thomas Aquinas was a Calvinist, although that's debatable. But the point is, this has been a powerful, powerful stream in Christian theology. Now, what exactly is Calvinism? Well, the essence of Calvinism, as you probably know if you've ever heard of it all, is summed up in this famous acronym, the TULIP. The T stands for total depravity, which is, of course, the doctrine that all people are affected by sin in all phases of who they are. They're totally disabled by sin and are not capable of doing good apart from God's grace. Secondly, unconditional election. That God chooses to save some people unconditionally and passes over the rest who are thereby inevitably damned. Thirdly, limited atonement, which is the claim that Christ died only for the elect, or at least in a different way for the elect and the non-elect. All right? Fourth, there is irresistible grace. Now, this is not a woman that you just can't stay away from. Okay? This is the idea that if God chooses to save you, you cannot resist it. You will be saved if He wants to save you. You're not going to stop it. And finally, there is perseverance of the saints, which is the claim that those who are truly saved, truly converted, truly elect, they will persevere, they will stay true to the faith to the end of their lives and consequently be saved. Now, the T and the P are held by a number of other Christians who are not total Calvinists. In fact, total depravity would be held in one form or another by all Orthodox Christians. All right? Perseverance of the saints, the idea that once saved, always saved, is held by a number of Baptists who are not altogether Calvinists. All right? So what really distinguishes Calvinism is what I call uli in the middle. Unconditional election, limited atonement, and irresistible grace. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on, particularly unconditional election and irresistible grace. Now, to help you understand these, let's begin by looking at a couple of passages from the Westminster Confession, a classic Calvinist doctrinal standard. And here we have this statement. There we go. Westminster Confession 3:5. Those of mankind that are predestined unto life, God, before the foundation of the world was laid, according to His eternal and immutable purpose, and the secret counsel and good pleasure of His will, hath chosen in Christ unto everlasting glory, out of His free grace and love alone. Notice this, without any foresight of faith, or good works, or perseverance in either of them or any other thing in the creatures as conditions or causes moving him thereunto, and as the Calvinists see it, all to his glorious grace. Now notice, the Calvinist is saying God does not look ahead, foresee that some people will have faith and choose to save them on the basis of he foresees they will have faith, or that they will persevere in good works, or anything like that. It is utterly unconditional. God does not choose you because he knows you will have faith. It's the other way around. If God chooses you, you will have faith. If he doesn't choose you, you can't have faith. That's the way it is, all right? So, that's a good statement of unconditional election. Now, here's a good statement illustrating irresistible grace. All right. Again, Westminster Confession. All those whom God hath predestined unto life, and those only. Notice, this is just for the elect. He is pleased in his appointed and accepted time effectually to call. Now, there's in Calvinism this notion of two different kinds of call. There's the effectual call, which is only for those that are saved. And then there's the general call, which goes to everybody. We're going to see this later on. So the Calvinist says, God invites everybody in the sense that he says, whosoever will may come. But only some people, the elect, get this effectual call. All right? So here's how it's described. Effectually to call by his word and spirit out of that state of sin and death in which they are by nature, to grace and salvation by Jesus Christ, enlightening their minds spiritually and savingly to understand the things of God, taking away the heart of stone and giving them a heart of flesh, renewing their wills, and by his almighty power determining them to that which is good, and effectually drawing them to Jesus Christ, yet so as they come most freely. Interesting? Being made willing by grace. Okay, this is interesting, isn't it? These last lines that I got in blue. Notice, he determines them to that which is good. And yet they come most freely. Now, if you're moderately thoughtful, you're going to say, whoa, Jerry, what's going on here? Determining them? Yet so as they come most freely. Not somewhat freely. Most freely. Being made willing by his grace. Now, here's what I want to emphasize to you right out at the outset here. If you're going to understand Calvinism and critically interact with it and be an intelligent advocate or opponent, you have got to understand this point. A lot of people who talk about this don't have a clue about this point. Don't understand it. And what's at issue here is the concept of freedom. Now, I can tell you a bit about this myself autobiographically. I remember years ago when I was in seminary, I had this good friend who was a Calvinist. I went to Princeton Seminary, and he came to Princeton Seminary too, and he was finishing a PhD in math at Princeton University. So he's real smart. And he and I used to argue about this for hours on end, hours and hours. And it always just was really perplexing. It just seemed like we just kind of passed each other in the night like two ships. I could never quite nail down what he was saying, and he could never quite, and I could never understand what was going on. Later, I came to understand, here's the problem. We were operating with two different understandings of freedom. And neither one of us really understood it at the time. That's why our conversation just kind of passed each other. Now, let me make this very, very clear. The deepest issue in this debate is not the nature of freedom. Now, Calvinists like to say it is. R.C. Sproul likes to say, Arminians are all about, Patrick freedom, give me liberty or give me death. It's all about human autonomy. James White likes to say this kind of stuff all the time. It just isn't right. This is not the deepest issue. It's critical to understand the deepest issue. If you don't understand this, you can't understand the deepest issue. But the difference in freedom is not what divides Calvinists and their opponents. Something much more important we'll get to later. All right? But you've got to understand the freedom difference to understand the deepest difference. All right? So, here is what we need to look at more. What is the Calvinist understanding of freedom? Well, before I get to that, let me give you the common sense view of freedom, which I take it most people hold, and it's the libertarian view. And here's what a libertarian says. A free action is one that is not determined by prior causes or conditions. As he makes the choice, the agent has the power to choose A and the power to choose not A. And it is up to him how he will choose. Now, I take it most of you would say, well, yeah, if I'm free about who I'm going to vote for in the presidential election, let's say, or something like that, I got to be able to choose both guys. I got to have the power to choose both. If I can only choose Obama, I have the power to choose him, but not Romney. Is that a free choice? I don't think so. Most of us would take it that freedom requires this. Now, here's what you need to get. The Calvinist doesn't agree with this view of freedom. For the Calvinist, freedom is a different matter altogether. We can call this view, and it is called, self-determinism or compatibilism. And here's what the self-determinist compatibilist holds. There is no logical inconsistency between freedom and determinism. Freedom and responsibility are compatible with total determinism. Now again, commonsensical, intuitive view would say, that can't be right. You can't be determined completely to do something, make a given choice, let's say, in such a way that you couldn't have possibly done otherwise and still be free. Calvinist, compatibilist, determinist says, yes, you can. If you understand what freedom means. You don't have to have the ability to do both A and not A. All right, so how does a Calvinist, how does a compatibilist, how does a self-determinist understand freedom? Well, here's what they will tell us. Free action has 3 conditions. All right, they go like this. A free act is not caused or compelled by anything external to the agent who performs it. So in the first place, if someone forces you against your will, if someone like bodily grabs you and carries you out of this hall tonight, okay, and all the time you're protesting, say, wait, I want to hear the rest of the lecture, I want to hear the rest of the lecture. You didn't leave the room freely. Okay, a free action is not one that is compelled against your wishes. All right? So it's not caused by anything external to the agent, as it would be if you were forced against your will by a simply physical force or something like that. Notice, however, it is, however, caused by something internal to the agent, namely a psychological state of affairs such as a belief, a desire, or some combination of these two. Okay? So when you make an action, you are determined to act based upon the beliefs, the desires, the internal psychological states of affairs that you're experiencing. You cannot act otherwise given those, and those things are caused by things external to you. So something external to you causes you to have the beliefs, the desires, the wishes, etc. that you have. But then once you've got those, you act out of those in such a way that you do what you want to do, given the fact that you have been caused to have those desires, thoughts, wishes, feelings, etc. You couldn't act differently. But you're still doing what you want to do because you're acting out of feelings you have, thoughts you have, wishes, desires you have. They're internal to you. You are doing what you want to do even though you can't act otherwise. Now, thirdly, I don't know if you can read this one. The agent performing the act could have done differently if he had wanted to. So they express this in terms of this kind of a counterfactual conditional. If you wanted to act differently, then you could have. But of course, you can't want to do otherwise because you've been determined to have exactly the thoughts. So if you had been determined to have different thoughts, feelings, desires, then you could have acted differently. But given the actual thoughts, feelings, desires, wishes you in fact have, you cannot act differently than you do. But still true that say you could have acted differently if you wanted to. All right? So the Calvinist, the compatibilist, the self-determined says, what more do you want? You're not compelled. The only cause is internal to you, and you could do differently if you wanted to do so. All right, now let's go back to that passage that we looked at earlier. Let's go back and look at this again. This description of the effectual call. And notice how God works on those he chooses to save. What does he do to them? All right? He changes the way they think. He enlightens their minds, spiritually and savingly, to understand the things of God, which they could not do before. Secondly, he takes away their heart of stone and gives them a heart of flesh, changes their heart. Thirdly, he renews their wills, changes the way they will, so that they will differently, right? And by doing all of this, he determines them to that which is good, and yet, so as they come most freely, being made willing by his grace. Now, it's not nonsense after all. It's coherent. As long as you understand freedom the way the compatibilist defines freedom. Now, if you try to talk about determinism and libertarian freedom, that's another matter. That's utter inconsistency. But determinism and freedom compatibilistically defined are perfectly consistent. All right, so Calvinism can be understood in a way that is internally consistent. All right, so let me make that very clear. Now, I also want to make clear that I'm not foisting on Calvinists something they themselves recognize or reject. So philosophically sophisticated Calvinists know they have to be compatibilists. So John Feinberg, for instance, who is a Calvinist, teaches or taught at Trinity Divinity School, and writes as follows: Calvinists as determinists must either reject freedom altogether or accept compatibilism. Those are your choices. Can't be a Calvinist and do anything else. Either just reject freedom or define it in these compatibilistic terms. So again, this is what Calvinists themselves recognize that they've got to commit to. So I'm not trying to saddle them with something they themselves reject. Now, here's where you really need to start getting why this is important. There is a huge, huge implication that I cannot overstate that follows from the compatibilistic understanding of freedom. And here it is. And again, this is a Calvinist saying this. He recognizes this. Paul Helm, one of the best Calvinist minds in the world, taught at the University of London for many years, recently retired from the University of London in England. And he says, if we suppose some form of compatibilism, then God could have created men and women who freely, in a sense compatible with determinism, did only what was morally right. Now, do you get this? God could have determined things. He could have made people free, as Calvinists define freedom, in such a way that they would have freely done the right thing all of the time. God could have determined all people to freely, gladly, joyously worship Him and praise His holy name forever and ever. But He didn't want to do that. But He could have, at least as far as freedom is concerned. He could have determined everybody to have loved Him, to have loved their neighbors. He could have determined, instead of Adolf Hitler doing what he did, to have made him a great benefactor. The guy at Penn State who abused the children. He could have determined him to have been a man who nurtured men and women and boys and girls in a healthy way, but that's not what he chose. And yet they would have done it freely, as Calvinists understand the term. Sorry, I don't mean to be giving you guys a shower there. I'm getting a little excited here. All right, now, Now, here's a really important argument I want you to think about. I call this the Calvinist conundrum. And you can see the force of this once you grasp this notion of compatibilism. Here's an argument. And I've spelled this out in a much more rigorous fashion for those of you who are philosophically inclined. Look up an article in a journal called Philosophia Christi from last summer called Why No Classical Theist, Let Alone Orthodox Christian, Should Ever Be a Compatibilist. And I spelled this out and made it fully valid. Here I'm giving you the short version of it, where you can see the basic argument. All right, premise number one, God truly loves all persons. All right, pretty much something almost everybody would want to say. Secondly, truly to love someone is to desire their well-being and to promote their true flourishing. Okay? Now, you may not give your kids everything they want. They may want a candy all the time, but if you love them, you will give them healthy food and try to do what is really good for their true flourishing, for what really fulfills the ends for which they were created, helps them truly to grow and like. If you really love someone, that's what you'll do. All right? Now, premise number three. The well-being, true flourishing of all persons is to be found in a right relationship with God, a saving relationship in which we love and obey Him. Seems pretty clear from anyone who accepts a Christian view of the human nature. And finally, fourth, God could determine all persons freely to accept a right relationship with Himself and be saved. Conclusion? Well, therefore all will be saved. Now, as I say, I've shown that this follows logically in the much more complicated argument, but I think you can see the basic logic of why this follows. Okay? Now here's the problem. Most Calvinists aren't universalists. Most Calvinists don't believe everybody's going to be saved. Far from it. In fact, many Calvinists believe that the vast majority of the human race by far is destined for damnation forever. Now, here's the question. Here's the point. If you understand logic, what you know is this. If an argument is valid and you reject the conclusion, you have to reject one or more of the premises. Now, I call this the Calvinist conundrum because the question is, what's a Calvinist to do with this? Now, as an Arminian, I can tell you very quickly the premise I reject. I reject this one because I don't think freedom and determinism are compatible. I reject this one. So I don't believe everybody's going to be saved, but the reason I don't is because I can believe all these first three, but I can reject this one. Calvinist can't. Unless you're going to reject three, which is pretty much basic Christian anthropology, a Calvinist has only got two options left, two or one. You can either deny that God loves everybody, or you can deny that to love someone really is about wanting their true flourishing, and define love in some idiosyncratic way that's different from what we normally mean by the word. Now, as we're going to see, Calvinists take a number of variations on this. So let's proceed. All right, so consistent Calvinism. You can be a consistent Calvinist, as I say. Here's what a consistent Calvinist looks like. Consistent Calvinist understands compatibilism. They understand the implications. They understand that huge implication that Paul Helm, the Calvinist that I just quoted, pointed out. And they embrace the implications without flinching. Now let me give you some examples of consistent Calvinism. Arthur W. Pink, classic Calvinist theologian, says this: when we say that God is sovereign in the exercise of His love, we mean that He loves whom He chooses. God does not love everybody. Now, right out of the, if you just heard that statement right up front in a non-Calvinist lecture, you might be a little shocked. Some theologian gets up and says, God doesn't love everybody. Probably a little, whoa, where did he get that? But I would submit to you that Arthur W. Pink understands the logic of Calvinism perfectly and doesn't flinch when it comes to the implications. He understands that, hey, if you're going to say that God is completely sovereign, can save anyone He wants to, but He doesn't save some people, I'm not going to try to say that He loves these people, He chooses to damn forever. That'd be crazy. So he just admits it. God doesn't love everybody. There it is. All right, here's another example. R.K. McGregor writes, another Calvinist theologian, if God had elected to save everyone without exception, all would certainly be saved. But God never had, and by the way, the blue stuff is my italics. But God never had the slightest intention of saving everyone. That's what the doctrine of election means in the first place. God chooses some, but not all. Now, interestingly, later in his book, he makes this personal. And he says that God may have reasons of his own for choosing me for salvation and not my Father, who, so far as I know, died an atheist. May well be so, but it is certain that I did not supply him with those reasons. So God may have chosen his Father for hell. Now again, a consistent Calvinist will understand he could just as easily have determined his Father freely, gladly, joyfully to accepted Christ and the gospel, but he chose to determine things in such a way that he died an atheist. Okay? One more example. Your generation's favorite Calvinist is coming up next. Who would this be? Oh, yeah. He's almost as good a Calvinist as Calvin himself, maybe better. John Piper, writing, makes it personal too, and he says, but I'm not ignorant that God may not have chosen my sons for his sons. He's talking about the fact that he'd go in every night and pray for sons before they go to bed. And in the context of talking about praying for his children every night, he said, but God might not have chosen them for salvation. I know that. And though I think I would give my life for their salvation, so maybe Piper loves his sons better than God does. Maybe. I would give my life for their salvation. If they should be lost to me, I would not rail against the Almighty. He is God, I'm but a man. The potter has absolute rights over the clay. Mine is to bow before his unimpeachable character and believe the judge of all the earth has ever and always will do right. So again, understand. Be sure you understand when you say this. God could have, if you have a relative that you believe is lost, or that does not accept the gospel, or has rejected Christ up to this point in his life or her life, understand, as the Calvinist sees it, God could have determined this person freely, gladly, joyfully to have accepted his grace and loved him and loved other persons as he wills. But he didn't prefer that. All right? So this is consistent Calvinism. You understand compatibilism. You understand the implications of it. You embrace them and you do not flinch. Very few Calvinists like this in my experience. The vast majority waffle all over the place and obfuscate. Now let me look at those. All right? Let's now look at inconsistent Calvinists. And let me use as my example here the noted popular writer J.I. Packer. J.I. Packer. And here Packer writes, man is a responsible moral agent, though he is also divinely controlled. Man is divinely controlled, though he is also a responsible moral agent. The reality of human moral agency and responsibility in a world where God is Lord is one of the mysteries of creation, which we reverently acknowledge, but do not pretend fully to understand. Now, if you've ever read much Calvinist writings, you will notice this. A frequent move they make, and by the way, I really find this interesting because Calvinists often come across as the intellectual ones, the really serious ones. I find it really curious how often they punt to mystery and do so in the guise of superior piety in the face of the inconsistencies of their thought. It's curious to me. But at any rate, notice this, that God controls things, and yet people are responsible. And he says, this is a mystery. Now, what's interesting here is this. Apparently, Packer is not a compatibilist, or at least he doesn't understand compatibilism if he is, because if you understand compatibilism, it's not a mystery. Freedom and determinism are perfectly compatible if you define freedom in the compatibilist sense. It's not a tension at all, you see. So if you talk about it as being a tension, You must somehow be trying to hold together both determinism, sovereignty defined as determinism, and libertarian freedom. And that's what Packer apparently is affirming. And yet he says, well, I can't see how these can be consistent, but it's a mystery. And if you're pious, you will acknowledge it as a mystery and just say, well, just because I can't understand it doesn't mean it can't be true. Right? That's the kind of thing Packer says. So we continue. Packer says, accept it for what it is and learn to live with it. Refuse to regard the apparent inconsistency as real. Put down the semblance of contradiction to the deficiency of your understanding. So if it seems to you a contradiction to say both that God is sovereign in the sense that He determines everything that happens, and that people are free in the libertarian sense, which is by definition freedom that is incompatible with determinism. If it seems to you that those things can't be both true, just put it down to your weakness of understanding, just because you can't grasp it, how both of these things can be true. Now, interestingly, a number of Packer's fellow Calvinists have been very critical of him about this point. Paul Helm, that I quoted a minute ago, philosophically sophisticated Calvinist, says this: in these circumstances, what is the difference between an apparent consistency and a real one? How do we know that what is called an antinomy, and that's what Packer calls an apparent inconsistency, an antinomy might not turn out to be a real inconsistency? So a number of his fellow Calvinists have said, look, you just can't throw logic out the window like that. You got to be consistent. You got to hold to logical consistency, which is why, again, philosophically sophisticated Calvinists recognize they have to be compatibilists if they're to retain coherence. You see, all right? So Helm says, look, this apparent inconsistency that he points out looks like a real one, and if that's the case, if you can't tell the difference between the two, we might be believing contradictions all the time, and that's a really troubling thing to think. So he's very, very, very troubled by this. Now, let's explore this a little further, whether Packer is just inconsistent. And let me take a couple minutes getting clear on some basic distinctions that are often confused with respect to the difference between a mystery and a contradiction. Now, what is a real contradiction? Well, first of all, there are explicit contradictions. An explicit contradiction is when a statement is simultaneously affirmed and denied. Bach is a bachelar. Bach is not a bachelor. Now, notice, it would not be a contradiction on Friday before Bach's wedding to say Bach is a bachelor, and then the following Sunday say Bach is not a bachelor. But if you say at the same time, you say both of these things, sorry, that is utter incoherence, and it cannot possibly be true. And it cannot simply be a mystery how they can both be true. They can't both be true. Now, not all contradictions are this obvious. Often they are buried, they're implicit. So here's an example of an implicit contradiction. An implicit contradiction is one which you can make explicit by adding definitions and employing basic logic. So, take these two statements right here. Bach is a bachelor, Bach is a married man. That is an implicit contradiction. It's not explicit in the way that Bach is a bachelor, Bach is not a bachelor. But you can make the contradiction explicit by spelling out, well, what exactly is a bachelor? Well, a bachelor is an unmarried man, by definition. All bachelors are unmarried men. Bach is an unmarried man, if all bachelors, etc. So then you see you have an explicit contradiction between 2 and 4 once you spell out what is implicit. Now, typically, the kind of contradictions you find in Calvinism are like this. They're not explicit. They're usually implicit, all right? And that's what we're going to see, I think, in the case of Packer. Now, here's another thing we need to distinguish. We need to distinguish real contradictions from apparent contradictions. And another thing that's often confused with contradiction is paradox. And what is a paradox? A paradox is a verbal contradiction that is not a substantial contradiction. Okay, that is to say, on the face of it, it looks contradictory, but the only reason it is because of the way things are defined. And once you define what you mean, the contradiction disappears. So I'm crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, paradoxical. But that's not a contradiction, because what does he mean when he says, I am crucified with Christ? Well, he means his old self, his old sinful self. When that was put to death, when Christ came into his life, that's when he really started to live. So he's using the word in a different sense. So on the face of it, you just spell it out as paradoxical, but once you define what he means, contradiction disappears. All right? So a contradiction is not a paradox. Paradox is only an apparent contradiction, and you can eliminate it very easily by simply spelling out what you mean by the terms. Now, another thing that a contradiction is not is a mystery. Another thing that a contradiction is not is a mystery. What is a mystery? A mystery is a truth that, while not contradictory, is beyond our full understanding. Unlike a paradox, it cannot be easily resolved by making the terms explicit. And the classic example here is this. There's only one God. God exists in three persons. Now, notice, if we said God existed in one person and three persons, you would have a contradiction. If you said there is only one God and there are three gods, you would have a contradiction. The Trinity doesn't say either. It says one God and three persons. And while we can't fully grasp this, it is not logically incoherent in the way that outright contradictions are. Now, let's go on with Packer. So Packer spells out what he sees as the differences between Calvinism and Arminianism and what he says they are not. And he emphasizes what he claims is common ground with Calvinists and Arminians. He says, so the basic difference between the two positions is not that Arminianism discerns a bona fide free offer of Christ in the gospel that Calvinism fails to discern and take seriously, nor that Arminianism acknowledges human moral responsibility before God, while Calvinism reduces our race to robots. So he says that's what Arminians often say. Arminians often say, we believe God loves everybody. We believe God sends out the gospel to all persons, but Calvinists don't. And Packer says, we think the universal call of the gospel is also true. We think God makes a bona fide offer to all people too. Just like Arminians. That's not the difference. And the difference is certainly not that they take responsibility seriously and we think people are robots. We think they're responsible too. All right? Now, continue. Continues to spell out what he says the Reformed tradition will insist upon. Everyone in the Reformed mainstream will insist that Christ the Savior is freely offered, indeed freely offers himself to sinners in and through the gospel, and that since God gives all free agency, that is voluntary decision-making power, we are answerable to him for what we do. But Calvinism at the same time affirms the total perversity, depravity, and inability of fallen human beings, which results in them naturally and continually using their free agency to say no to God. Now, which view of freedom does he really believe in here? It's kind of confusing. When you read that first part of it, it sounds like libertarian freedom. He gives people free agency, the power to make choices. And then at the bottom, when he's talking about depravity, he makes it clear that they can't really choose good, that they're totally incapable of doing the right or anything like that. So it's kind of confusing. But at any rate, here's the point that's interesting. Packer insists that Calvinists too believe that God makes a bona fide, what does bona fide mean? Good faith. God makes a good faith offer to all people of the gospel, indeed offers himself in good faith. Now, how can he say this and be consistent? Well, I think he can't. And here is the problem. All right? Packer's position leads to the following claims. Core Calvinism. Only the elect can actually accept the offer of salvation. Now, if there's anything utterly clear, that's it. Only those that are unconditionally elect can respond. Remember that passage describing the effectual grace? It goes out to those that are called, and only those, nobody else. If you're not elect, you can't respond to the gospel. All right? So, only the elect can actually accept the offer of the gospel. Secondly, not all are elect. Conclusion, not all persons can actually accept the offer of salvation and be saved. That seems pretty clear. That's basic core Calvinism. But then we got Packer saying this kind of a thing, insisting God makes a bona fide offer of salvation to all persons. Now here's what you got to simply say. Well, what does he mean by that? When he says a bona fide offer. Is he saying that God says, you're invited, but you can't really come, and I know you can't really come, and I could make you come, but I'm not going to, but I'm offering it to you anyway? Wink, wink. Is that what he means by that, by a bona fide offer? I mean, if that's what he meant and he spelled out explicitly, wouldn't you just think he was joking to call that a bona fide offer? So when he says bona fide, don't you take that to mean sincere, honest, that you really could respond to it? He insists on this, right? So I'm taking that this is what he means. If this is not what he means, he's just being rhetorically dishonest. Okay, so a bona fide offer is one that can actually be accepted by the person to whom is offered. So Packer's either being dishonest or it's being misleading. So I will choose to believe that he's not dishonest. So I will take it that this is what he means. If he's not being dishonest, he's got to mean this by a bona fide offer. Otherwise, it's just rhetorically, utterly misleading. So I'm assuming he's honest. This is what he means. Conclusion, all persons can actually accept the offer of salvation and be saved. Now, do you notice anything? We have discovered an implicit contradiction here. Having spelled out the premises and the implications, here's what you get. 3, not all persons can actually accept the offer of salvation and be saved. 6, all persons can actually accept the offer of salvation and be saved. Friends, that is an outright contradiction. As much as saying Bach is a bachelor and Bach is not a bachelor. You cannot make both of these true by appeal to mystery, by appeal to antinomy. It doesn't make you pious to think you can. It makes you confused. Okay? So, there's the contradiction. Now, let's go on. We still got some ground to cover here. I'm really glad you guys stayed. I appreciate it. I really do. I'm getting hot up there. Is it okay if I take my jacket off? I'm suffocating. All right. Now, let's go on. Let's go on to what I call ambiguous Calvinism. Ambiguous Calvinism. And this takes place when Calvinists trade on both conceptions of freedom. And as someone who's been reading Calvinist literature and studying it and critiquing it and analyzing it for several years now, I will tell you, you will see this all over the place. So once you understand compatibilism and understand it, start reading this stuff, and you will see Calvinists saying stuff all the time that they cannot consistently say on their premises. So what they often do is slide back and forth between a libertarian view of freedom and a compatibilist view of freedom. When they're talking about God's wonderful grace saving people and He's electing them to salvation, they're compatibilists. But then when they talk about sinners disobeying God and doing wretched things, suddenly they sound like libertarians. All right? So, here is another Calvinist theologian, John Calvin, who's almost as good a Calvinist as Piper, not quite. But he's up there, right? I know you don't like him as much as Piper. Okay, but I'm really listening to this fascinating passage from Calvin. There's the general call. This is the call of the gospel that goes to everybody. Whosoever will may come. There's the general call by which God invites all equally to Himself through the outward preaching of the Word. Even those to whom He holds it out as a savor of death and as the occasion of severer condemnation. Now, you following this? There was this doctrine that used to be prominent in Calvinism. You don't hear much about it anymore, but it used to be very prominent in classic Calvinism called the dreaded false hope. And this was the fear that you might not truly be elect, and even though you were converted, you might have fallen away, and that might be evidence that you weren't really elect, and you dreaded, oh my God, I thought I was elect. It seemed like I was for a while, but now I'm not so sure. And lots of classic Calvinists struggled with this fear that they were not truly elect. And this passage right here is what it was based on. So Calvin is trying to make sense of backsliders, what people in the Arminian tradition call backsliders. People who are converted and then fall away. How do you explain them? Here's Calvin's explanation. God holds out to some people that are not truly elect the gospel as a savor of death and as the occasion of severer condemnation. So it can condemn them more severely than other people. That's why he does it. The other kind of call is special, which he deigns, notice, for the most part, to give to believe the believer alone. Yet sometimes he also causes those whom he illumines only for a time to partake of it. Then he justly forsakes them on account of their ungratefulness and strikes them with even greater blindness. Now here's what I want to ask you. How do you make sense of this on compatibilist terms? Doesn't it sound like he thinks they could have responded to the gospel? That they could have stayed true to it and should have? And that's why God justly punishes them more severely? Because after all, if he wanted to, he could have determined them willingly, gladly, freely to have stayed true to the gospel, but he didn't. And here it sounds like they could have, though, and that's why they get blamed. So here's what you'll see in Calvinism. Again, I repeat, ambiguous Calvinism. Trading on both conceptions of freedom, often not even being aware of it, sounding at sometimes like good compatibilists, and then when they want to blame sinners and critique things like this, they suddenly sound like libertarians. All right? Now, here's another kind of inconsistent Calvinism. It's what I call misleading Calvinism. Now, I really like Arthur Pink, the guy that I quoted at the beginning. He's forthright. He just faces the music. You know, he bites the bullet. You know that phrase? He bites it, he clamps down on it and says, God doesn't love everybody. But here's the problem. Not many Calvinists are this forthright. And in fact, let me say this to all my Calvinist friends who are listening to this. This is how Calvinism maintains credibility. By continuing to use the rhetoric of universal love in a way that their theology does not support. If Calvinists were forthright in embracing the implications of their theology, if they bit the bullet and did not engage in misleading rhetoric, Calvinism would lose credibility in 2 years. It stays afloat by Calvinists talking about God's love in a way that their theology does not underwrite. Here's a great example. D.A. Carson, Calvinist New Testament scholar, Trinity Divinity School. That says this, when I've preached or lectured in Reformed circles, that's Calvinist circles, I've often been asked the question, do you feel free to tell unbelievers that God loves them? Now, man, you might think that's a crazy thing. Do you feel free to tell unbelievers God loves them, for crying out loud? Isn't that the gospel? That God loves people, all of them, that He died for the world? Isn't that the gospel?